And here's our second lesson on foreign policy, lesson 25, entitled Pirates, War, and so much more. So in this one, we're going to get a little action. Our first one, we want to look at the events from 1809 to 1823, that we can explain the causes, events, and effects of the War of 1812, the U.S.'s second war. We look at the foreign policies of President Thomas Jefferson, which we started in the last lesson, and go on to James Madison and James Monroe, that we can explain the importance of the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll define and explain here, and that we can describe the importance of President James Monroe to the early republic. And as always, we're looking at different places and regions. So, there be pirates. Thomas Jefferson is still president, and the issue he's dealing with is pirates attacking American ships along the Barbary coast of North Africa. And what we mean by the Barbary coast, here is the Atlantic, here is Europe to the north, here is the north coast of Africa, and this Barbary coast all along here with cities like Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli is called the Barbary coast. Well, anyway, North African pirates are attacking American ships as they try to cross the Mediterranean Sea. Now, they are demanding to be, how do you stop the attacks? You got to pay us off. That's what pirates do. Now, if you look here, John Adams saying, George and I just paid him, TJ, cheaper than keeping a navy, because that's true. George Washington and John Adams did pay tribute to these pirates to keep them off American ships. So now it's up to Jefferson. Is he going to pay, or is he going to fight? Is he going to take on Captain Jack Sparrow here? Looks a little scary. I'm not sure. And Jefferson's solution is a little bit of both. First of all, they do send a small navy over to the Mediterranean to fight the pirates. And they do this with some success, but the U.S. warship Philadelphia is captured in Tripoli and ransomed by the pirates. So finally, the U.S. agrees to pay Tripoli off with a bribe of about $60,000, but the pirate problems continue for the next 10 years or so. So a little bit of both. Yes, they do fight some, but they end up paying up, and it still doesn't solve the problem. And oh well, that's how that's what happens when you deal with pirates. Then we had James Madison from 1809 to 1817. So Madison is continuing the Democratic Republican rule of Thomas Jefferson, and he offered, I mentioned that that Britain and France are both attacking American ships. That was what the Embargo Act was over. Well, James Madison sends a peace initiative to both Britain and France, and he says, whichever of you will leave us alone and quit attacking us, we'll make peace with you. The British say no, but Napoleon, who is the Emperor of France, he agreed on the surface, but he actually keeps up the attacks. Like he says here, do we have a deal? Said, yeah, sure, sucker. So the French continue to attack American ships. In the meantime, things with Britain are getting even worse. They're continuing their attacks and their impressment, which is, again, kidnapping of American sailors. They're also supplying guns to the natives in the Northwest. Remember Tecumseh? We talked about him in one of our previous lessons. Well, he's one of the ones that they're giving guns to. So the British are causing problems both on the Atlantic Ocean and here in North America. And that's going to lead to the question, the issue, should the United States declare war on Great Britain? Now, first of all, you have the group that says no. These are the Federalists. Remember, they like Britain. So the Federalists, New England merchants, because they're afraid, and bankers, they're afraid that the first thing British are going to do is come over, set up a blockade, and they're going to lose trade. It's going to cost them a lot of money. And again, we also have the memory of George Washington. George Washington's been dead now since 1799, but in his farewell address, he said, guys, don't get involved in foreign affairs, and starting a war would certainly be an example of that. So don't forget his advice. Kind of stay out of it. Try to find a peaceful solution. However, in favor of war, you have the Democratic Republicans, the South and West, and farmers, because they want to expand west. And the British and the natives are in their way. So they want America to defeat the British, stop the support for the natives, and let them expand west. And they are led in Congress by a group called the War Hawks. And this group is led by Representative Henry Clay from Kentucky, which back then, remember, Kentucky is actually sort of a frontier state, kind of on the western, the western area of American expansion. So the War Hawks are pushing for war with Great Britain. So what's going to happen? What happens is, yes, we go to war, the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is the one that a lot of adults don't really know much about, except when it started, because it's called, the War of 1812. And there are two phases to the war. In Phase 1 starts from 1812 to 1814, and during this phase, Britain is still at war with France and Europe, so they're really not paying much attention over here. And during this time, the U.S. wins several naval battles. Oliver Perry becomes a hero for the Battle of Lake Erie. And the U.S. takes this opportunity to launch an invasion of Canada. And it's in this invasion that Tecumseh, the Native American leader, is killed at the Battle of the Thames. However, the U.S. fails to conquer Canada, so nothing much changes. So phase 1 is sort of something of a draw, a failure for the United States. So that leads to phase 2 of the war from 1814 to 1815, and in phase 2 Britain has defeated France, and now they're going to turn their whole attention over to dealing with the Americans. So one of the first things they do is they launch an attack along the coast and attack Washington, D.C. They burn down the White House, which has only been standing a little more than 10 years. They burn other government buildings, and the president and the cabinet are forced to literally flee Washington with the British Army behind them. They also attack but fail to conquer Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland, just outside of Washington. What makes this battle so important, or at least famous, is that Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer, witnessed this battle from a British ship, and on this battle he wrote a poem that became the Star-Spangled Banner after seeing the American flag flying the next morning and realizing that the British had failed to conquer the fort and take Fort McHenry. And from this, of course, we get our national anthem. So the British strategy to conquer the U.S. also fails. So the next point of attack for the British is going to be along the Gulf of Mexico, where they invade the important port city of New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi River. So in January 1815, they are met by General Andrew Jackson, and his army defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. And this battle is an overwhelming victory. There are 71 American casualties compared to 2,000 British casualties, so it wasn't even close. It was a sound defeat for the British. It made Jackson a hero. The Americans are really thrilled about this. And it also ends the war on a high note because what they don't know, again, this battle happens in January 1815. Again, back then, no email, no Instagram, no Twitter, no news, not even any radio. So what they don't realize is that the war has actually been over for about 2 weeks because they signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the War of 1812 at the end of December. So the Battle of New Orleans, probably one of the most important battles of the war, happened several weeks after the battle is over. But again, it makes a big hero of this man, Andrew Jackson, and we're going to hear a lot more of him later on. The effects of the War of 1812. As a war itself, the War of 1812 really didn't accomplish much. Neither side won. There were no major changes. No major territory changed hands. So really, it was almost kind of a useless war. But it really did have some important effects. One, the death of Tecumseh and the loss in the Native American losses in the Northwest greatly weakened Native resistance to American expansion west. Americans came out of this very proud of themselves. They called it the Second Revolution, saying we've whipped the British for the second time, so they kind of came out feeling pretty good about it. Generals Harrison in the Battle of the Thames and Andrew Jackson would go on to become future presidents. So two generals would use their war records to help them run and eventually win the presidency. Also, the fact that the Federalists opposed a war which became popular ultimately ended the Federalist Party. So really the Federalists are out of power and their party's pretty much done. And also U.S. industry expands during this time, and in Unit 6 we'll talk about why. But the U.S. is going to come out of this in the beginnings of becoming a world industrial power. Finally, we have President James Monroe from 1817 to 1825. He's a Democratic Republican, and he ran with no Federalist opposition. Could you imagine a presidential election when only one candidate really is winning or running and there is no opposition to him? His issues. One is that Latin America, which is everything kind of south of us from Mexico down to Central and South America, countries in Latin America are gaining their independence from Spain and Portugal, and they're fearing that other European countries might try to come in and invade and fill the gap left by Spain and Portugal. Also, up to the northwest, Russia wants colonies in Alaska along the Pacific Northwest. So how would the U.S. respond to both of these threats, the possibility of foreign countries invading Latin America and the fact that Russia wants to take some of our territory up in the north? So the solution here is the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. So in his State of the Union address to Congress, Monroe gives a speech in which he says that the American continents, meaning North and South America and also the Caribbean are off limits to future European colonies, and that the U.S. would protect the Western Hemisphere of the world. So what he's doing is he's basically drawing a line saying, you guys stay on your side of the world, and we're going to stay on our side, and y'all are not going to come over here and create any more new colonies. And the British actually agree with this, and they will use their naval power to help enforce the Monroe Doctrine. And this showed the fact that the U.S. is gaining confidence in world affairs. This also is a result of the War of 1812. The U.S. is becoming more assertive with the rest of the world. So an important part of the Monroe Doctrine address says that the American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers, so you guys stay on your side. So our next issue is, where is the border between British Canada and the U.S. going to be? And this solution is fortunately made by a treaty, in which it's set at the 49th parallel, the 49th degree of latitude, and this sets the boundary all the way over to the Rocky Mountains. So the Convention of 1818 with Britain, we draw this line, and that is today still the border between us and Canada. Another issue is that the U.S. and Spain have a disputed boundary between the Louisiana Territory, which again we bought from France, right, in 1803, and Spanish Florida. So they're not sure where that boundary line is. And the other problem is that Spain is not enforcing laws in Florida, and Florida is kind of becoming something like an outlaw hangouts for pirates and outlaws to go out and hang out in Florida, because there's not much law enforcement, and there's also natives here that are coming up and attacking American settlements along in Georgia. So if Spain's unable to enforce the laws, the U.S. says we'll send soldiers down there to do it. So in the Adams-Oniz Treaty of 1819, the U.S. takes claim of Florida and annexes Florida. So that's how we gain the Florida Territory, through the Adams-Oniz Treaty. And we're going to end this unit with a little bit of strange but true history. And that is that we talked about how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams had been friends during the Revolutionary era, but when they went against each other in the election of 1800, that harsh election kind of ended their friendship. But in 1812, at the urging of their wives, they began to write each other again, and they renewed their friendship. So on July 4th, 1826, both Adams and Jefferson, who lived hundreds of miles apart, but both of them died on the same day, which happened to be Independence Day and the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence they both worked on. So kind of an interesting historical coincidence there. And it's reported that John Adams' last words before he died was that Thomas Jefferson survives, because he didn't know that Thomas Jefferson had died a few hours before him. So that kind of just on a little bit of strange but true history to end Unit 5. And our Lesson 25 thoughts. One of the most important things to come out of Lesson 25 was our learning about the War of 1812, so we want to summarize the main reasons the U.S. declared war on Britain and the major effects of the War of 1812. And finally, do you think the Monroe Doctrine was a continuation of Washington's foreign policy, again, remember neutrality and isolationism, or do you think it was a split from it? And defend your answer. And again, that concludes our study of Unit 5.